So, here's the thing about Far Cry 3. It probably shouldn't have worked as well as it did. Think about where this series was before it. The first game was a technical showcase that turned into a mutant-infested fever dream halfway through. It had groundbreaking visuals, impressive AI, and a plot that went completely off the rails the moment Krieger decided genetics was a hobby worth pursuing. The second was a grueling survival sim set in a war-torn African country that actively hated you for playing it. A game where your guns jammed, your body failed, and your best friend could bleed out in a ditch because you forgot to carry extra syringes. Both interesting, both ambitious in their own right, but neither of them screamed mainstream franchise. And then Far Cry 3 comes along in 2012 and just figures it out. It takes the open world foundation that Far Cry 2 laid down, the outposts, the combat, the sense of being dropped into a hostile world and told to deal with it, and it wraps it in something more accessible, something fun, and something that doesn't make you feel like you need a tetanus shot every time you pick up a weapon. It files down every rough edge that made Far Cry 2 polarizing, borrows the tropical color palette of the original, and packages the whole thing into an experience that feels designed from the ground up to be enjoyed rather than endured. It became the template, not just for the Far Cry series going forward, but for a whole generation of open world games. The loop of liberating outposts, climbing towers to reveal map segments, crafting gear from animal hides and earning skill points to unlock new abilities. If that sounds familiar, it's because every Ubisoft game for the next decade was essentially a variation of this formula. Assassin's Creed adopted it, Watch Dogs adapted it, Far Cry itself repeated it entry after entry, even Ghost Recon got in on the action. Far Cry 3 practically defined an entire design philosophy, but Far Cry 3 isn't just remembered for its systems, it's remembered for a performance. For a character, for Michael Mando standing in front of you, eyes wild, telling you the definition of insanity. That monologue became bigger than the game itself. It became a meme, a cultural touchstone, a shorthand for charismatic villainy in games. And the fact that a single performance can overshadow an entire open world shooter's worth of content tells you something about the power of that performance and the nature of what surrounds it. Because Far Cry 3 is a great game, I genuinely believe that, but it's also a game with a very specific set of strengths and a very specific set of blind spots, and I think it's worth pulling those apart. Not to diminish the game, but to understand why it landed the way it did. So, let's go back to the Rook Islands and see what exactly made this game the cultural zeitgeist it became. To understand Far Cry 3, you have to understand what Ubisoft Montreal were reacting to. Far Cry 2 was a fascinating game that a lot of people bounced off. The respawning checkpoints, the gun degradation, the malaria, the relentless hostility of the world. All of it was intentional, all in service of a specific vision, and a lot of players simply didn't want what it was selling. Critically, it did well enough, and commercially, it performed respectably, but it wasn't the kind of game that could build a mainstream franchise. It was too abrasive for that, too committed to making you uncomfortable. The kind of game where the people who loved it really loved it, and the people who didn't couldn't articulate exactly why it felt like homework with a flamethrower. So, the mandate for Far Cry 3 was, in broad strokes, keep the open world, keep the immersion gameplay, keep the sense of freedom, but actually make it fun. Make it something people actually want to spend 40 hours in, rather than something they endure and suffer through for 15. Strip out the systems that punished players for engaging with the game, like the weapon degradation, the malaria, and the bus stop fast travel that dropped you 3 miles from where you actually needed to be, and replace them with systems that reward engagement. That's not a criticism of Far Cry 2's approach. I still love that game to death, but Ubisoft did want to sell a lot of copies, and the path to doing that ran through accessibility, for better or for worse. The development was led by Patrick Plorde as creative director, with the narrative side shepherded by Jeffrey Yoalam. Yoalam's influence is particularly worth noting because his ambitions for the story, specifically the idea that Far Cry 3 should function as a commentary on video game power fantasies, would become one of the most debated aspects of the finished product, but we'll get to that. The island setting was a deliberate pivot back toward the tropical vibes of the original Far Cry, but filtered through a modern open world sensibility that owed far more to Far Cry 2's structure than the Crytek's corridor to sandbox level design. The outpost system was retained and refined. Far Cry 2's guard posts were frustrating, largely because they respawned endlessly, so Far Cry 3 made liberation a more permanent thing. Clear an outpost and it stays cleared. The map fills with friendly NPCs, the territory is yours. It's a simple change that transforms the outpost from a repetitive annoyance into a reward, and it's arguably the single most important design decision in the game. The crafting and progression systems were built to create a tangible sense of growth, which is something Far Cry 2 deliberately avoided. In Far Cry 2, you were always vulnerable, always scraping by. Far Cry 3 wanted the opposite arc. You start weak and you get stronger. You start scared and you become dangerous. This was both a gameplay decision and a narrative one. The mechanical progression was designed to mirror Jason Brody's transformation from frightened tourist to jungle predator. And then there was Voss. Michael Mando was cast relatively early into development, and by most accounts, his addition essentially defined the character. The original concept for Voss was much more restrained, a pirate leader with a mean streak named Bull. But Mando brought an energy and unpredictability that the team recognized immediately as something special. Rather than asking him to dial it back, they built around it. They gave Voss more scenes, more screen time, and more room to breathe. And by the time marketing kicked into gear, Voss had essentially turned into the face of Far Cry 3, front and center on the box art, starring in all the trailers, delivering a monologue that would define the entire campaign. He even got his own promotional series right here on YouTube. The game was built on the Dunia Engine 2, an evolution of the same technology that powered Far Cry 2. The engine was designed for large open worlds with dynamic systems, and the team pushed it further with improved vegetation rendering, water physics, and draw distance. The Rook Islands needed to feel vast, detailed, and alive, and the engine delivered on that front. Far Cry 3 is a gorgeous game, not in the technically demanding way the original was, and not in the oppressive atmosphere-first way the second entry was. It's gorgeous in a way that's almost inviting. It wants you to look at it. It wants you to stop on a hilltop and take in the view. And for a game about pirates, drug trafficking, and the psychological disintegration of a 20-something Californian, that's a surprisingly effective tonal choice. The Rook Islands are the star here. What Ubisoft pulled off is impressive. Variety within a single, continuous, explorable space. Dense tropical jungle, thick with foliage that sways in the wind. Gives way to white sand beaches where the water is so clear you can see the fish beneath the surface. Rocky cliff faces overlook valleys dotted with ruined temples, overgrown with moss and vine, hinting at a history the game only partially explores. There are cave systems that open into long-lost ruins. Underwater grottos where the light filters in through shafts. Shantytowns built from rusted metal, military compounds bristling with watchtowers and razor wire, and all of it exists on a map you can traverse freely, without loading screens and without the game ever taking control away from you to shuttle you between zones. The scale is important. These aren't small islands either. The North Island alone is a substantial landmass, and the game fills it with enough geographic variety and points of interest that exploration feels rewarding even when you're not heading towards a specific objective. You can spend a good few minutes just driving along a coastal road, watching the scenery shift, stumbling across a hidden cave or an unmarked animal den, and it never feels empty. The South Island introduces a different aesthetic, more militarized, more oppressive. It's a noticeable shift that serves the story's escalation, even if it's not as visually inviting as the North. The lighting is particularly strong. Far Cry 2 weaponized its lighting. The harsh African sun was part of the hostility, bleaching the screen, creating heat haze, making you squint. Far Cry 3 does something entirely different. The golden hour light filtering through the jungle canopy, the way the water catches the sun in the shallows and scatters it into caustic patterns. It's all designed to make the islands feel like a place you'd actually want to be, which is a clever bit of tonal work, because the game needs you to understand why Jason and his friends chose to vacation here in the first place. It's a narrative choice. These islands are seductive before they're dangerous, and the lighting is a core part of selling that seduction. The fire propagation system returns from Far Cry 2, and while it's a little less impressive and less central to the gameplay, it's still a spectacular visual effect. Setting fire to a patch of grass and watching it spread across a hillside, consuming brushes and trees, sending animals fleeing and enemies scrambling. You just have to see it in motion to appreciate what Dunia 2 is truly capable of. Character models and animation are solid for 2012. The major characters like Voss, Citra, Hoyt, Dennis receive noticeably more detailed facial work than the supporting cast. Voss is the obvious standout. The facial capture and animation during his scenes are a cut above everything else in the game. There's a range and specificity to his expressions, a flair to the movements around his eyes and mouth that makes every scene he's in feel like the team poured their best resources into it, which, knowing how central he became to the marketing, they almost certainly did. The general NPC population is less impressive. Friendly islanders and pirates share a limited pool of character models, but it's an open world game from 2012, and the standards were different. Far Cry 3's audio is warmer than its predecessor. It wants you to feel present in a place that's beautiful and dangerous in equal measure. The jungle hums with insect life. Cicadas, crickets, the buzz of flies near standing water. Birds call from the canopy, monkeys chatter in the distance. Waves break against the shore with that specific rhythmic quality. The wind moves through the vegetation with a density that matches the visual. At night, the soundscape shifts entirely. The daytime chorus gives way to a quieter, more unsettling palette. Nocturnal creatures, distant sounds that might be animals, or might be something else. The weapon audio is a massive step up from Far Cry 2, and it needed to be, because the guns need to feel good for 40 plus hours. Each weapon category has its distinct audio identity. The assault rifles have a sharp percussive crack that cuts through the ambient noise. Shotguns have a heavy, satisfying boom with a tail of reverb that changes depending on whether you're indoors or outdoors. The sniper rifle has that specific delayed echo that makes long-range kills feel physical. The bow is almost silent, and that quietness is part of what makes it feel so good to use. Explosions are appropriately thunderous, with a layered quality that combines the initial blast with secondary sounds, debris raining down, fire crackling, the groaning of damaged vehicles. The grenade launcher and C4 in particular have a bass-heavy punch that you feel in your chest if you're wearing headphones. It's the kind of audio work that makes you want to blow things up just to hear the results. Brian Tyler's score strikes a difficult balance. It needs to serve a game that is simultaneously a tropical adventure, a psychological thriller, and an over-the-top action romp. Tyler leans into a percussive, world music-influenced palette. Drums, strings, flute-like motifs. They evoke the setting without feeling like a caricature of it. The combat music escalates appropriately, building from tension stingers into full-blown action cues. And the exploration music knows when to step back and let the environmental audio do the work. It's not a score that demands attention the way some game soundtracks do, but it's one that consistently reinforces the mood without ever fighting it. The voice work rounds out the audio picture, and the quality varies in a way that roughly tracks the character hierarchy. Manuel's voice is obviously the standout, not just in terms of the writing, but in the sheer physical detail of the performance. You can hear the saliva in his mouth when he speaks close to the mic. You can hear his breathing change when he shifts from calm to agitated. It's an intensely physical vocal performance that goes well beyond reading lines with emotion. The rest of the cast ranges from strong to functional. Jason's friends are competently voiced but not particularly memorable, which is arguably by design. They're the normal people Jason is leaving behind, and their relative blandness reinforces how much more alive the island's characters feel by comparison. This is where Far Cry 3 earns its reputation, and where it sets the template that an entire generation of open world games would follow. The core loop is deceptively simple. You explore the islands, you liberate outposts held by enemies, you climb radio towers to reveal sections of the map and points of interest, you hunt animals to craft gear upgrades, and you complete story missions and side activities to earn experience points that feed into a skill tree. None of these individual systems are revolutionary. Open world games had been doing versions of most of them for years at this point, but the way Far Cry 3 interlocks them, the way each activity feeds into and rewards the others, the way progression in one system creates motivation to engage with another. Let's start with the outposts, because they're the heart of the experience and arguably Far Cry 3's single best contribution to game design. Each outpost is a small enemy encampment with a specific layout, a set number of guards, and one or more alarm systems. Your job is to take it. How you do that is entirely up to you. You can scout from a distance with your camera, tagging enemies to track their patrol routes and identify special threats like snipers, heavies or dogs. You can sneak in, crouching through vegetation, using silent takedowns to pick off a few isolated enemies before the shooting starts. You can perch on a hilltop with a sniper rifle and methodically eliminate guards one by one, timing your shots to the gaps in patrol coverage. You can disable the alarms first by cutting the wires or shooting the boxes, and then go loud with an assault rifle, knowing that no reinforcements will arrive. You can release a caged animal, a tiger, a bear, a Komodo dragon, and let nature do the dirty work while you sit back and watch. Results may vary. Or you can just drive a jeep through the front gate with a mounted gun and see what happens. The magic is that all of these approaches are viable, and the game's systems are robust enough to generate genuinely surprising moments no matter which one you choose. The leopard you released might kill 3 guards and then turn its attention towards you. A fire you started as a distraction might spread in a direction you didn't expect, cutting off your exit route. You might not be as good with the sniper rifle as you've talked yourself up to being, turning your careful plan into a messy improvisation. The outposts are smaller sandboxes within the sandbox itself, self-contained tactical puzzles with enough systemic complexity to generate stories that feel like they're yours. And critically, once you clear an outpost, it stays cleared. Friendly Rakyat warriors move in and pester you to check out the jobs on the bulletin board. Fast travel opens up. The surrounding area becomes safer. You feel the map shifting under your influence, the pirate territory shrinking as the Rakyats expands. It's an incredibly satisfying sense of territorial progress that Far Cry 2, with its endlessly respawning guard posts, never offered. You'll also get an XP bonus for clearing an outpost without being detected, or without triggering the alarm. It's a small but brilliant incentive. It encourages stealth without mandating it, and it gives purists a reason to reload and try again if a clean run goes sideways. The radio towers are the less interesting half of the exploration loop. They're essentially climbing puzzles that function as map reveal mechanisms. You arrive at the base of a tower, navigate a series of platforms on ladders to reach the top, interact with a thingamajig, and a section of your map fills in with icons showing points of interest, collectibles, and activities. They're fine, they serve their purpose. The view from the top is usually spectacular, and there's a mild satisfaction to the climbing itself, figuring out which platform leads where, finding the correct path through what looks like a jumbled mess of metal and wood. But they're also the element that got copy-pasted most aggressively into every open world game that followed, to the point where they became an industry punchline. It's worth noting that in Far Cry 3, they actually work reasonably well. They're short, they don't overstay their welcome, and the map reveal provides a genuine sense of discovery. The problem wasn't the towers themselves. The problem was that every game for the next decade decided they needed their own version, and the mechanic was never interesting enough to bear that kind of repetition. Far Cry 3 used towers as a simple, functional tool, but the industry turned them into a fucking cliché. The exploration between objectives is where the open world really shines. The Rook Islands are dense with stuff, not in an overwhelming, map covered in icons way that later Ubisoft games would fall victim to, but in a way that means heading from point A to point B almost always involves encountering something interesting along the way. A pack of wild dogs attacking a group of pirates, a sunken ship visible from a cliffside, a cave entrance half hidden by vegetation, a hang glider perched on a ridge, offering a shortcut across a valley. The world feels handcrafted in a way that rewards curiosity, and the available vehicles ranging from cars, trucks, jet skis, boats, and hang gliders give you enough traversal options that getting around stays fun, even when you're backtracking through familiar territory. Crafting also makes its first appearance here, tying exploration to progression in a way that feels organic. You can hunt animals and use their skins to craft larger wallets, ammo pouches, weapon holsters, loot rucksacks, and other various gear upgrades. It gives the wildlife a mechanical purpose beyond atmosphere, and it encourages you to engage with the hunting systems, which are genuinely enjoyable. Tracking a leopard through dense jungle, waiting for it to emerge from cover, lining up a clean shot with the bow, and knowing that its skin is going to let you carry more syringes. That's a satisfying loop. The system also creates natural micro-adventures. You'll always need specific animal hides, say a rare one-horned buffalo skin for the final wallet upgrade, and suddenly you're jumping through bushes, hunting the thing with a shotgun, in a completely different gameplay experience from the outpost assault you were doing just 10 minutes ago. The crafting system pushes you toward experiences you might not seek out on your own, and the game is richer for it. The limitation is that the crafting system has a very hard ceiling. Once you've made every upgrade, and a thorough player will hit that ceiling well before the game ends, the animals lose all their mechanical purpose. Hunting becomes a pure side activity rather than a progression driver, and the world loses one of its key factors. It's a natural consequence of a finite crafting tree, and later Far Cry games will try various approaches to extending it, but in this game, there's a noticeable point where the crafting system stops mattering entirely. The shooting itself is a significant step up from Far Cry 2, where Far Cry 2's gunplay was deliberately rough, rusty weapons, a certain unreliability, and a rawness that matched the game's survivalist tone. Far Cry 3's weapons feel snappy, responsive, and satisfying to use. Every gun feels like it works, and that reliability is part of the power fantasy the game is selling. The weapon variety is solid: assault rifles, SMGs, shotguns, sniper rifles, LMGs, pistols, bows, and explosives. Each weapon can be customized with attachments like suppressors, extended magazines, and a variety of sights. Weapons are unlocked either by purchasing them from shops or by activating radio towers, which makes the towers feel more rewarding than a simple map reveal. The customization isn't as deep as a dedicated military shooter, but it's enough to let you shape your loadout to your playstyle. The melee system, particularly the takedown mechanics, adds a stealth layer that complements the shooting nicely. The basic takedown is a simple machete kill from close range, but as you unlock skills, the system expands into chain takedowns, death from above, death from below, knife throw takedowns, and grenade takedowns. At their best, these create cinematic sequences where you chain together 3 or 4 silent kills in rapid succession, flowing through an enemy patrol like a horror movie antagonist. It's empowering in a way that's deliberately at odds with who Jason is supposed to be at the start of the story. The skill tree is structured around 3 branches: the Heron, which focuses on long range and mobility, the Shark, focused on assault and tanking, and the Spider, focused on stealth and survival. Each unlock adds a new segment on Jason's tattoo, the tribal tattoo that visually marks his progress from tourist to warrior. It's a nice aesthetic touch that ties the mechanical progression to the narrative, even if the actual skill tree isn't especially deep by RPG standards. The best abilities, like the takedowns and various grenade and knife throw skills, meaningfully change how you approach encounters. The less interesting ones are the passive stat boosts: more health, faster crouch speed, and longer breath underwater. You take them because down the line you saw a skill that actually caught your eye, but the skill tree does its job. gives you a sense of growth, it encourages you to try different approaches, and it creates a satisfying feeling of mechanical mastery that mirrors Jason's own transformation. Side activities fill out the world with enough variety to keep exploration from feeling empty. Path of the Hunter challenges send you after specific animals with restricted weapon loadouts. Kill some bears with a submachine gun, hunt some leopards with a sniper rifle, or take down a rare golden tiger with a bow. Wanted Dead missions task you with assassinating pirate lieutenants using a melee takedown. Supply drop challenges are off-road time trial vehicle races, and hundreds of collectibles are scattered across both islands. Relics, memory cards, and letters of the lost, some of them adding to the world's history and lore. Not all of these activities are equally compelling. The supply drop races, while fun, are standard checkpoint chasing filler, and the collectibles, while numerous, don't offer enough reward to justify the time investment unless you're a true completionist by nature. But the hunting challenges and the assassination missions are genuinely enjoyable, and they provide reasons to explore corners of the map you might otherwise ignore. There's also various minigames in the towns and outposts, adding a bit of flavor. They're simple, but they serve as bridges between action sequences and give the safe zones a reason to exist between being generic fast travel points. And while we're on the subject of fast travel points, let's talk about them. I know, just don't use it. That's the response, right? That's always the response. And sure, technically, you can't just not press the button. You can ignore the 40-something fast travel points dotting your map and drive everywhere manually like some kind of open world purist. But game design isn't just about what's available, it's about what's encouraged. And when you've liberated every outpost on the North Island and your map lights up like a constellation of instant travel options, the game is very clearly encouraging you to skip the world it spent years building. In the early hours, this isn't a problem. You have a handful of liberated outposts, and the gaps between them are large enough that every trip involves genuine traversal. But as the outpost count climbs and the map fills in, the distance between fast travel points shrinks to the point where you're never more than a 30-second drive from one. And at that point, the question stops being, should I fast travel? And starts being, why wouldn't I? Far Cry 2's approach to fast travel was the opposite extreme. Those bus stops were so sparse and so inconvenient that most players just drove everywhere, which meant every trip was an adventure and every adventure was a potential disaster. I'm not saying Far Cry 3 should have gone that far, but there's a middle ground between bus station in the middle of bumfuck nowhere and teleport to literally any liberated point on the map, and Far Cry 3 never finds it. You don't even need to be at an outpost to teleport to another outpost. You can just teleport wherever you please without any real penalty. It's a small thing. It's the kind of thing you only really feel in the back half, when the game has given you so many tools of convenience that the inconvenience has been optimized away, and it's a little bit immersion breaking, honestly. If there's a criticism to level at the gameplay, it's the lack of escalation. Far Cry 3 is at its best in the early hours, when you're underpowered, under-equipped, and every outpost feels like a genuine challenge. You have 2 weapon slots, a basic pistol, limited ammo, and no skills to speak of. Every encounter requires caution, every alarm that triggers feels like a crisis, and the tension is very real. But the progression systems are generous enough that by their midpoint, you're comfortably overpowered. Once you've unlocked chain takedowns, crafted the bulk of the upgrades, stockpiled enough explosives to level a small country, and armed yourself with the game's best firearms, the game's difficulty essentially plateaus while your power continues to climb. The tension drains out of encounters that should still feel dangerous. The second island, where Hoyt's professional mercenaries replace Voss's ragtag pirates, should theoretically raise the ceiling. The privateers have body armor, heavier weapons, and more aggressive tactics, but by the time you reach them, you're already so mechanically empowered that the increase doesn't register the way it needs to. It's not that the game becomes boring, but it's less exciting, less tense, less dynamic than those early hours when every outpost was on a knife's edge. It's a common problem in open world RPGs. The player's growth outpacing the world's ability to challenge them, and Far Cry 3 doesn't solve it. Later entries in the series would experiment with level gating and enemy scaling. But here, the curve is what it is. Steep at the start, flat in the middle, and essentially horizontal by the end. But even with that caveat, the moment-to-moment gameplay remains genuinely excellent throughout. And if the template it created was eventually ran into the ground by repetition across a dozen other titles, that's not really Far Cry 3's fault. It built the damn thing. What came after it built it again and again and again until people got tired of it. But there's another problem with the gameplay that doesn't get discussed as much as the difficulty curve, but honestly bothers me more, because the difficulty curve is a balancing issue, and balancing issues are solvable. This is more of a game design philosophy issue, and it's one that's only gotten worse in the years since. Far Cry 3 does not trust you. It doesn't trust you to find your way. It doesn't trust you to read the environment. It doesn't trust you to figure out that the ledge with the yellow paint on it is climbable, because Jason will helpfully mutter, "I could probably climb that," before you've even looked at it. It doesn't trust you to stay in cover during a firefight, because Jason will practically remind you, out loud, unprompted, that staying behind cover is a good idea, as though the bullets hitting the wall next to your head weren't communicating that message clearly enough. And it doesn't trust you to remember what you're supposed to be doing. because the game will remind you of your current objective constantly, even when you've been deliberately ignoring it for the last 3 hours because you're busy getting collectibles on the other side of the island. And it absolutely does not trust you to color outside the imaginary lines the developers drew up. Try wandering too far from the prescribed path during a story mission. You are leaving the mission area. Go any further and it's an instant game over. It doesn't matter that you're flanking. It doesn't matter that you saw a better angle from the ridge to the east. The game has decided where this mission takes place, and you will play it within those boundaries. For a game that sells itself on freedom, the story missions are startlingly rigid about where you're allowed to stand while completing them. And then there are the civilians. The previous entry let you exist in a morally grey world. Everyone was a potential threat, and the game didn't hold your hand about who deserved the bullet and who didn't. The consequences of violence were yours to reckon with, not the game's to adjudicate. Sure, the game had no firing zones, but even those didn't stop you from blowing a guy's brains out because he looked at you funny. Far Cry 3 puts guardrails on that entirely. Kill one too many civilians and you get a game over screen, a full stop. The game doesn't trust you to engage with the moral texture of a war zone. It just removes the option. You're the good guy. Civilians are off limits. Don't even think about it. And look, I understand the reasoning. I do. Ubisoft was making a mainstream product for a mainstream audience, and mainstream audiences generally don't want to accidentally commit war crimes during their leisure time. Mission boundaries keep players from accidentally breaking scripted sequences. Objective reminders prevent confusion. Jason's self-narration is an accessibility feature for people who might not be capable of reading environmental cues intuitively. None of this is malicious. None of it is lazy. It's considered intentional design aimed at ensuring the broadest possible audience has the smoothest possible experience. But smooth isn't the same as engaging, and when you stack all of these guardrails together, what you get is a game that's quietly, persistently telling you how to play it, not through difficulty or consequence, but through restriction and narration. It never lets you truly get lost, it never lets you truly mess up, and it never lets you sit in the discomfort of a decision the game hasn't pre-approved. Compare this to Far Cry 2. That game dropped you in and said, good luck. It didn't remind you where to go. It didn't tell you what to do. It didn't narrate your options. If you made a bad call, you died in a ditch and reloaded. But you learned something. The world was hostile, but it respected you enough to let you navigate that hostility on your own terms, including the moral ones. Far Cry 3 replaced that trust with comfort, and while that comfort is part of what made it a mainstream hit, it's also what makes certain moments feel like playing a game with a backstage driver who has their hand hovering over the wheel at all times. Now, I want to be fair, this is 2012. The hand holding here is mild compared to what the industry would eventually normalize. Play a AAA title from 2020 onwards and Far Cry 3's objective reminders feel quaint by comparison. Hell, play the later entries in this actual franchise. Far Cry 5 and 6 are so aggressive about directing your attention, populating your screen with notifications, and funneling you toward content that 3 looks positively restrained. This isn't a disease at its worst, but they are the early symptoms. But I noticed it. Every time Jason told me something I already knew. Every time the mission area boundary snapped me back to where the game wanted me. Every time the objective tracker nudged me like an impatient sat-nav. I noticed, and it irked me. Every single time. Not because it ruined the experience, it didn't, but because it was a constant, low-level reminder that the game I was playing had a very specific idea on how much freedom it was actually willing to give me. And that tension between the freedom the game advertises and the freedom it actually allows is something that the series has never resolved. It's only gotten worse. The story of Far Cry 3 is trying to do something interesting. Whether it succeeds is a conversation that's been going on for over a decade, and I don't think there's a clean answer, because the game's narrative ambitions and its moment-to-moment identity are pulling in directions that don't always align. The setup is pretty straightforward. Jason Brody and his friends, a group of wealthy, carefree 20-somethings from California, are on vacation in the Rook Islands, skydiving, partying, documenting everything on camera. They're the kind of people who treat the world as a playground, and the Rook Islands seem like just another stop on the adventure tourism circuits. Then they're captured by pirates led by Voss Montenegro. The opening sequence is one of the most effective in the franchise. You see Jason and his older brother Grant held in a bamboo cage, watching Voss pace and monologue through the bars. It's disorienting, claustrophobic, and immediately establishes the power dynamic. You are helpless, and this clearly mentally unhinged man holds your life in his hands. Grant engineers an escape, gets you both out of the camp, and is shot dead by Voss just as freedom seems within reach. Jason falls off a bridge and into a river, and the screen goes black. When you come to, you're in a rock yacht village. Dennis Rogers, an outsider who's been adopted into the tribe, tattoos the first segment of the tatau onto your arm and tells you that you've been chosen by the island. Friends are scattered, being held for ransom, sold into slavery, or worse. And the only way to get them back is to become something you've never been. Dangerous. It's a strong hook. It takes the fish out of water premise and gives it genuine stakes, and the early hours do an effective job of conveying Jason's terror and disorientation. He shakes when he holds a gun, he visibly recoils after his first kill, His voice cracks when he talks about Grant. The game earns its inciting incident in a way that makes the subsequent power fantasy feel like it's growing out of something real rather than just handing you a gun and a waypoint. That transformation is the story's central thesis. Far Cry 3 wants to be a game about what violence does to a person, how the act of killing, even in service of a just cause, changes you in ways you can't undo. Jason starts the game scared, shaking, barely able to hold a weapon. By the midpoint, he's executing people with mechanical efficiency. And by the end, he's taking visible pleasure in the hunt, cracking jokes over dozens of corpses, speaking in a register that would be unrecognizable to the person he was in the opening scene. The people he originally set out to save, his girlfriend Liza, brother Riley, and his friends Daisy, Oliver, Keith, and Vincent, R.I.P. Vincent, they increasingly feel like obligations rather than motivations. They're anchors to a life he's outgrowing, and his friends notice. That's one of the subtler things this game does well. The conversations Jason has with his rescued friends get progressively more strained. Liza expresses concern, Daisy looks at him differently. There's a slow, accumulating discomfort in these scenes that comes from watching someone you care about change into someone you don't recognize. And it's effective precisely because the game has given you, the player, the same transformation. You've been enjoying the killing, you've been seeking it out. The skill tree is literally tattooed onto Jason's arm as proof of what he's becoming. It's a genuinely interesting idea, particularly for a game that is, at least mechanically, a power fantasy. There's a deliberate tension between the story telling you that Jason's increasing comfort with violence is a form of corruption, and the gameplay rewarding you for that exact same trajectory. The game is making you complicit in the thing it's critiquing. The question is whether that complicity is intentional commentary or accidental irony, and Far Cry 3's commitment is inconsistent. There are moments where the dissonance between Jason the character and the player's experience feel pointed and purposeful. And there are moments where it just feels like a regular video game that forgot it was trying to make a statement. The tonal whiplash between a cutscene where Liza confronts Jason about how much she's changed and a gameplay segment where you're cheerfully burning down a wheat farm to Skrillex is a lot. You can read it as deliberate irony. You can also read it as a game that doesn't fully control its own tone. Yohalam has been vocal in interviews about the game's satirical intentions, but a satire that needs its writer to explain it in post-launch interviews might not be landing the way it was intended to. And then there's Voss. And honestly, this might be the simplest thing I have to say in this entire essay. Michael Mando is fucking extraordinary in this role. Voss Montenegro is not a complicated character on paper. He's a pirate lord, an unstable, violent, charismatic and dangerous man. He gives speeches about insanity, he threatens you, he monologues. In terms of narrative function, he's a mid-game antagonist, the obstacle you overcome on your way to the real villain, Hoyt Volker. He doesn't have an elaborate backstory, he doesn't have a grand plan. He's just chaos in human form, and the game gives you just enough context to make his madness feel rooted rather than random. But Mando turns him into something magnetic. There's a volatility to his performance that makes every scene he's in feel genuinely unsafe. You don't know if he's going to laugh, scream, or put a bullet in someone's head. The physical detail of the performance is particularly remarkable. The way his jaw tightens when he's suppressing rage, the way his eyes go dead for a half second before he erupts, the way he touches his own face like he's checking it's still there. He shifts between charm and menace, between philosophical musing and animalistic rage, with a speed that keeps you permanently off balance. The definition of insanity monologue has been memed into oblivion at this point, but go back and actually watch the scene. Watch Mando's face, watch his eyes, watch the way he leans in, the way his voice drops, the way he seems to be genuinely working through the logic of what he's saying in real time, like he's hearing it for the first time, even though he's clearly said it before. That's acting, that's craft, and it's the kind of craft that you almost never see in video games, even today. The tragedy of Voss, however, from a writing perspective at least, is that the game doesn't give him enough room. He's the most compelling element of the entire story, and he's killed off roughly 2/3 of the way through. His death is handled through a hallucinatory, dreamlike sequence, and I fight in a psychedelic void that's visually striking but narratively unsatisfying. You don't get a clean confrontation. You don't get a moment of reckoning between Jason and the man who killed his brother. The game subverts the expected boss fight, which is a bold choice, but it replaces it with something ambiguous rather than something better, and then the game has to spend its final third pretending that Hoyt Volker is an adequate replacement. He isn't. Hoyt is a competent but conventional villain, a South African crime lord with a private army and a sadistic streak. He's menacing in a business-like way, which makes him a functional antagonist, but he doesn't have the electricity that Voss brought to every scene. Hoyt is dangerous because he has resources and cruelty. Voss was dangerous because he was a human being you couldn't predict. The difference is enormous, and the final hours of the game feel noticeably deflated by his absence. It's a structural problem the game never solves. You can't build your entire marketing campaign around the character, let that character deliver the most iconic performance in the game, and then remove him before the climax without leaving a vacuum. The last third of Far Cry 3 is a good game missing its best element, and no amount of narrative justification changes the reality of playing through it. Jason is a harder character to evaluate, because I think that the game's intentions with him are more interesting than the execution. The idea of a bro protagonist, this privileged, shallow, somewhat unlikable young man who discovers he has a talent for violence and gets entirely seduced by it. It's genuinely subversive for a AAA shooter. Far Cry 3 is, at least in part, a satire of the power fantasy it's selling you. Jason isn't meant to be aspirational, he's meant to be a cautionary tale, a demonstration of how easily a comfortable, modern person can be transformed into something brutal when dropped into the right circumstances. The issue is that the game doesn't always sell this reading. Jason's transformation happens quickly, arguably too quickly, and the game doesn't linger in the uncomfortable middle ground long enough for the corruption to feel gradual. He goes from terrified civilian to competent warrior to tattooed jungle god in a progression that tracks more closely with a standard hero's journey than with the psychological horror story the writers seem to be reaching for. By the time he's delivering tough guy one-liners and casually snapping necks, the satirical distance between what Jason is and what you'd expect a shooter protagonist to be has largely closed. He's become the cliche the game was supposedly commenting on. The moments where his friends express concern about him feel like they're coming from a different, more thoroughly written game. One where Jason's descent was slower, more granular, more disturbing. When Liza says she doesn't recognize him anymore, you feel the weight of what the game is trying to say. But then the next mission sends you on a standard assault with a standard weapon loadout, and this weight essentially evaporates. The story needs the gameplay to create friction. Instead, the gameplay smooths it away. There's also the supporting cast to contend with. Jason's friends are thinly drawn enough that losing them as anchor points doesn't carry the emotional weight this story needs. We don't spend enough time with them as people to feel the full cost of Jason drifting away from them. They're defined more by their function in the plot than by anything that makes them feel individually real. When the game asks you to choose between them and the islands, the choice should feel agonizing. Instead, it feels more like generic good ending and generic bad ending. Citra, the Rakyat leader and Vaas's sister, functions as the narrative embodiment of the island's seductive power. She draws Jason deeper into the warrior identity, frames his violence as spiritual awakening, and guides him through increasingly ritualistic ceremonies. She's the siren figure in a story about a man losing himself, and the game leans into that archetype with both feet. The problem is that Citra as a character doesn't have enough depth to support the thematic weight the story places on her. We learn that she's manipulative, that she's using Jason to reclaim the islands from Hoyt and Vaas, and that her spiritual framework is at least partly a tool of control. But the game doesn't give us enough of her interiority to make that manipulation feel complex. She's a function of the plot more than a person within it. The game offers two endings. In one, Jason rejects Citra and the Rakyat, saves his friends and leaves the island, and choosing his old life over the warrior identity. Citra is killed by Dennis, who's enraged by her rejection, and Jason delivers a voiceover about the monster he became and the choice to walk away. In the other, Jason kills his friends in a hallucinatory blood ritual, fully embraces the warrior path, sleeps with Citra, and is then killed by her in a ritual sacrifice, the ultimate expression of the island consuming him. Neither ending is entirely satisfying, but they're interesting as a pair. The save your friends ending is the happier outcome, but also the less thematically resonant. Jason just goes home, and the game doesn't explore what that homecoming looks like for someone who spent weeks killing hundreds of people with increasing enthusiasm. The voiceover gestures at the psychological cost, but it's a summary rather than a scene. The stay with Citra ending commits harder to the game's themes, but it does so through a sequence that's more provocative than earned. The death feels abrupt, the ritual feels arbitrary, and the whole thing lands closer to shock value than to genuine catharsis. The choice feels reductive for a narrative that spent hours exploring the gradual erosion of Jason's identity. It asks you to make a clean break in a story that's been about the absence of clean break. A more confident version of this game might have offered a single ending that synthesized the complexity rather than splitting into two unsatisfying halves. But for all its structural issues, I think Far Cry 3's story accomplished something significant. This was a mainstream, big-budget shooter that tried to interrogate its own power fantasy. It tried to make you uncomfortable with the thing it was asking you to enjoy. It tried to build a protagonist whose arc was defined by corruption rather than by heroism, and it didn't always succeed. Its satirical intentions are often buried in their gameplay that invites the exact fantasy it's supposedly critiquing, and its reach frequently exceeded its grasp. But the attempt itself mattered. It opened the door for later games to engage with the question of what it means to be the hero of a violent game. It proved that a AAA shooter could have ambitions beyond go here, shoot that, and it gave us Vaas, a character so vivid, so alive, and so fundamentally entertaining that he elevated the entire game around him into something people still talk about all these years later. Far Cry 3 shipped with both competitive multiplayer and a separate co-op campaign, and while neither of them became the game's lasting legacy, they're worth acknowledging as part of the overall package. The competitive multiplayer was a standard suite of modes: Team Deathmatch, Domination, Transmission, and Firestorm. It ran on the same systems as the campaign, and there was a progression system with unlockable weapons and attachments, loadout customization, and a map editor that allowed players to create and share their own multiplayer maps. The co-op campaign was a separate 4-player experience set 6 months before the main story, following an entirely different group of characters on a revenge mission. It was linear by design. A series of structured combat encounters strung together with a thin narrative. I remember having to slog through it countless times in order to unlock the buggy trophies for completing it, but it's long gone now. Retrospective made a solid video focusing largely on the co-op campaign, so I highly recommend checking that out if you want to hear more about it. Link down below. Far Cry 3's legacy is, of course, enormous. On the immediate level, it defined the Far Cry franchise for the next decade. Every numbered sequel and spin-off since has essentially been a variation of the Far Cry 3 formula. A charismatic villain, an exotic open world, outpost liberation, tower climbing, crafting, skill trees. Far Cry 4 refined it, giving you a denser world, a more fleshed out villain in Pagan Min, and a co-op mode that let a friend join your open world for the full story. 5 relocated it to rural Montana, swapping tropical islands for American heartland, and replacing towers with a more organic exploration system. A subtle acknowledgement that even Ubisoft knew the towers had run their course. Primal took the formula to the Stone Age, New Dawn turned it post-apocalyptic, and 6 scaled it up to a full island nation with Giancarlo Esposito's dictator at the helm. None of them fundamentally reinvented it. For better or worse, Far Cry 3 was the blueprint, and Ubisoft kept on building from it. Beyond the franchise, its influence on the broader open world genre is hard to overstate. The Ubisoft formula became the dominant template for open world game design for half a decade. Games as varied as Horizon Zero Dawn, Ghost of Tsushima, Batman Arkham Knight, and Mad Max bear the fingerprints of the systems Far Cry 3 popularized. Whether that's a compliment or a criticism depends entirely on how you feel about that template, but the influence is undeniable. Far Cry 3 didn't invent every element of this formula, but it was the game that assembled the pieces into a cohesive, commercially successful whole. And then there's Vaas. Michael Mando's performance transcended the game. It launched his career into mainstream acting, most notably as Nacho Varga in Better Call Saul, where he demonstrated the same ability to make every scene feel electrified by unpredictability. And it fundamentally raises the bar for what players expect from video game antagonists. The insanity monologue became one of gaming's most quoted lines. Vaas became the measuring stick against which every subsequent Far Cry villain was judged and found lacking. Ubisoft themselves recognized this cultural impact by bringing Mando back for the Insanity DLC in Far Cry 6, letting players experience the Rook Islands from Vaas's perspective in a roguelike structure. It was an acknowledgement that the character had become bigger than the game that created him. But legacy is a double-edged sword. The template Far Cry 3 established eventually became a source of fatigue. Not because it was bad, but because it was repeated until everyone got sick of it. The Ubisoft open world checklist became a shortcut for a specific kind of video game design. Wide but shallow, busy but not deep. And later Far Cry games, by sticking so closely to the formula without meaningfully evolving it, inadvertently made people forget how fresh it felt the first time. Far Cry 3 didn't create a formula to be repeated. It created an experience that happened to be formulaic in hindsight. The distinction matters, but it's been lost in the noise. Far Cry 3 is the game that taught a franchise how to be popular. It took the raw, abrasive ambition of Far Cry 2 and shaped it into something the mainstream could embrace. Something colorful, accessible, and endlessly playable. And it did so without sacrificing the emergent systemic core that made the series interesting in the first place. The outposts are still brilliant, the open world still rewards curiosity, and the fire still looks incredible. But it's not a perfect game. The story reaches for a thematic complexity it doesn't quite achieve. The difficulty curve flattens when it should escalate. The second island can't replace what the first island has, both as a setting and as an antagonist. The side quests feel like haphazard afterthoughts at best. The decision to remove its best character before the climax is a structural wound the narrative never fully heals from. And the satire of the power fantasy, if that's what it is, struggles to communicate itself through a medium that rewards the exact behavior it's supposedly critiquing. But the things it gets right remain genuinely excellent. More than a decade later, clearing an outpost with nothing but a bow and a plant is still one of the most satisfying experiences in the genre. And Michael Mando's Vaas remains one of the most electrifying performances in gaming history. A character so well acted that he elevated the entire game around him into something people still talk about, still quote, and still measure other villains against. All these years later, Far Cry 3 built a template that the industry eventually got tired of, but the template was built from a game that understood what made open world shooters fun and executed on that understanding with confidence, craft, and one absolutely unforgettable villain. And while the copies got stale, the original didn't. As always, thanks for watching to the end of this video. If you enjoyed, leave a like, a comment, and subscribe as I have 262 more games to cover. I've been Xenivus, more videos soon. Ish.